Thank you. All right, good morning and welcome to the Tri-State Dairy Exchange monthly webinar series. Today we are joined by independent nutrition consultant Kurt Cotanch to discuss rumen biochemistry and function and how we can nutritionally support the dairy cow in her efforts to convert dietary nutrients into milk and component production, and also how forage quality impacts rumen function and feed efficiency. Up next in this webinar series, we'll be hearing from Glenda and Sarah about their project working with producers in Maine and New Hampshire to improve calf and heifer management. And then in September, we will be joined by Dr. Paul Verkler from QMPS about milk quality. If you know anyone who might be interested in these topics, you can share the registration link by scanning the QR codes shown here. And just a reminder that you can access all the recorded webinars in this series on the UVM Extension Northwest Crops and Soils YouTube channel. The mission of our Tri-State Dairy Extension team is to advance dairy management, address shared industry challenges, and foster innovation through collaborative educational programs across northern New England, namely Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And our team includes Dr. Glenda Pereira from the University of Maine Extension, Dr. Sarah Allen from the University of New Hampshire Extension, and Whitney Hull and myself, Amber Maishi, the University of Vermont Extension Dairy team. Lots going on in the tri-state area for this end of summer time. Sarah, what's happening in New Hampshire?
So in August, we have a couple of workshops in New Hampshire. The first one will be up in Jefferson, New Hampshire. We will be looking at forage analysis and beef nutrition basics, so how to read your forage analysis. On the 21st in North Haverhill, we will be joined by our Assistant State Veterinarian, Nathan Harvey, to talk about foundations in dairy cattle health. On September 15th, we have another silvopasture twilight meeting in Stratham. And then we also have a dairy and livestock value added program where we're building a cohort of farmers that are either currently in the value added space or looking to get in the value added space to learn from each other and other producers in the region.
Super. And in Maine, you can tune into the Maine Farmcast by subscribing to the weekly podcast on your favorite podcast app. And you can access previous episodes on the UMaine Extension podcast website. Over the past month, Glenda and her team have covered topics including dairy wearable technologies, livestock judging, and on-farm milk quality management. And you can also save the date in Maine and register for the Farm Progress Tour at Mayday Farm on September 4th. This event is an on-farm discussion about how cow activity monitors work in a pasture-based system, and also solar panels and forage crop seeding mixes and management at Mayday Farm. In Vermont, you can join the UVM Extension Dairy Herd Management Team in collaboration with Stonyfield Organic for an in-person workshop and tour of 2 Franklin County dairy farms utilizing automated milking systems. On August 19th, this workshop offers a hands-on look at 2 different robotic milking setups, and the farmers will share their experiences transitioning to automation, including key discussion points, robotic milking unit selection, facility design and modification, herd management changes, and lessons learned throughout the process. It's a free workshop with lunch included. And we will drop the registration links for these events into our chat shortly. This month's featured podcast is the Real Science Exchange, sponsored by Balchem. Our guest today, Kurt, introduced me to this series, and I've been hooked on it. It's a research-based series with a unique and conversational approach, and I have learned so much from listening. They cover some really technical topics with well-known researchers and scientists, and I've enjoyed the conversations that focus on different aspects of dairy cattle nutrition. And we'll drop the link for that podcast into the chat as well. All right, it's time to dive into our topic today. I would like to introduce our guest speaker and my friend Kurt Cotanch. I first started working with Kurt almost 20 years ago when he worked at the Minor Institute in Shazy, New York, and I was part of the dairy management program there. And Kurt now works as an independent dairy nutrition consultant in Vermont, and I'm lucky to be working with him on farms in northern Vermont as part of some projects our team is collaborating on. Every time I work with Kurt, I learn something new or I gain a better understanding of some aspect of nutrition that I didn't quite grasp previously. And I'm always looking forward to more hours in the truck, driving from farm to farm, taking forage samples, talking to farmers about forage quality and feed management, and of course, making spreadsheets and graphs. This past winter, Kurt was the keynote speaker for our team's Organic Dairy Days discussion about forage nutrition for grass-based dairy operations. And last week, he and I facilitated a workshop at our annual field day focusing on forage fermentation and preservation, feed storage, and silage preservatives and inoculants. And those conversations have really paved the way for today's presentation about how the cow turns nutrients into feed and milk. So I will stop sharing my screen, and Kurt, you can take it away.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Amber. That was quite an introduction. You're able to hear me okay here?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think Amber knows me a little too well, and I'm going to apologize up front because I do tend to run down a lot of tangents, just because my brain is so dysfunctional and unorganized. But at least Amber's used to it enough. Um, all right, so I got a fair number of slides here. It's a good group. Please feel free to ask questions as we go, because depending on the road we take, I may not go down the same road twice. And my ADD, I couldn't decide which slide to start with. Why am I not advancing my slides? There we go. I've dealt with some goat farms in the past, and this was a picture from Miner Institute. We're going to be diving into that rumen there. Cannulated cows can have calves and reproduce. This is the general framework, right? Eating and rumination is the front end of the cow. We get into the rumen and we focus on basically our jobs are to facilitate microbial growth in order to degrade fiber and other ingredients, starch and proteins to make the VFAs that the cow metabolizes to make the metabolites for milk, meat, growth, reproduction, maintenance. So it's all about making microbial protein. The other thing I always keep in mind is small intestines. There is digestion of nutrients down there, right? And the degradability of some proteins and starches is key, to allow for small intestine digestibility. And then there's the hindgut. Today, we're going to focus on rumen and, oddly enough, this. Went to a CNC Cornell Nutrition Conference last year, and Lance Baumgard he gave a presentation, morning presentation. He said, what the biggest nutrient the cows actually produce is sugar. And when you think about it, milk is about 4.7% lactose, sugar. It's the osmotic regulator of milk volume. So when you have a cow making 85 pounds of milk at about 4.7% lactose, she's making a 4-pound jug of sugar on a daily basis. And as farmers, farm managers, and feeders, that's our job, is to make sure that rumen is able to provide the precursors to make 4 pounds of sugar a day. We're going to get into a little biochemistry later, but you've all heard of gluconeogenesis. Livers turning nutrients, predominantly propionate coming out of the rumen, into glucose. When propionate isn't sufficient, what do cows rely on next? Glucogenic amino acid precursors. Chiefly alanine is one of the main amino acids coming out of body tissue to maintain glucose production, blood glucose. And then glycerol, the backbone of the triglycerides, is also used to make sugar. But the end goal is that cow needs to make a lot of blood glucose, in order to make lactose. All right, so if you've seen me, any of my presentations, these are the initial slides. I'm going to cruise through these fairly quickly. It's the basic stuff we all learn in nutrition classes. Feed in, carbohydrate, proteins, microbial degradation. The waste products of that microbial fermentation process are the VFAs, propionate, acetate, butyrate, along with hydrogen and CO2. Evolutionarily, that hydrogen combines with the CO2 to make methane, and she burps it back out. This is the protein slide. Proteins enter the rumen, generally get torn apart and broken down into ammonia and other nitrogenous compounds. I don't want to get into too much detail here. Some protein escapes, but we need to make sure for optimal rumen and microbial function, we need to provide the right balance of ammonia, true proteins, and peptides to provide the myriad of different microbes fermenting sugar, starches, and fiber, the proper amount of ammonia, nitrogen, and peptides. This is an old slide, but we understand that carbohydrate, the the fractions of carbohydrates follow this chart, and I think Mary Beth Hall was the originator of this long ago. And we see carbohydrates come in the soluble form, in the fiber form. We break that down into NDF and ADF and so forth. I think everybody's seen this or understands it, but I honestly, I really keep this when I'm going on farm and looking at diets and looking at cows. This is like the backdrop in my brain. And okay, what level of sugar, starch, pectin is in this ration? Because we know that sugars will ferment to butyrate, starches ferment to propionate, and the fiber fractions ferment to acetate. So we're making the precursors to all that blood glucose. Butyrate is used somewhat for milk fat, but most importantly, I actually have to correct this slide. Butyrate is predominantly used by the rumen epithelium and the GI tract. You can provide energy to the cow in general, but a lot of this butyrate is utilized right there in the GI tract. Propionate, we know, goes to the liver for lactose. We'll get to that. And acetate is a chief precursor for milk fat. Okay, so then we're walking on the farm and say, well, what forages are we looking at, and what's the breakdown of these carbohydrates? So recently been on a farm with wrapped round bales and say, okay, good fermentation. The sugars have been utilized in that crop to ferment the feed properly, silage, baleage, so forth. Not much starch in a haylage bale, but if this was corn silage, that arrow would be a big fat arrow of starch. Pectins would be smaller in corn silage, but grasses have a fair number of pectins and long chain fermentable carbohydrate that are not necessarily fiber. And then, of course, we have our NDF fraction cellulose, which is highly degradable depending on plant maturity. Pasture has a much different nutrient profile. A lot of sugars in that fresh grass. It's photosynthesizing in real time. Where do sugars ferment to? A lot of butyrate. Keep that in mind. Starch is very few. Soluble fibers, pectins, highly degradable cellulose. We can make a lot of acetate with fresh grasses. Fortunately, propionate is the one that goes to blood sugar, that goes to lactose, that goes to milk volume. We don't have a lot of precursor for blood glucose. What do these microbes need? They need a free nitrogen source, urea, ammonia. The cow does a great job of recycling excess nitrogen that isn't utilized as ammonia through saliva. The bugs, surprisingly or not, need true protein. They need amino acids. And we've probably heard of Zinpro's new product, isofirm, which is basically Kodak's iso acids reinvigorated, and they are a stimulant of microbial growth. On the mineral side, we always want to make sure there's enough sulfur for the sulfur-containing amino acids. So the other key word that I kept thinking about is the supply of these nitrogen sources in synchrony with the type of carbohydrate we have in the ration. In other words, do I have enough of not only the right NPN and peptide, but the rate of degradation, the rate of availability of these nitrogen sources, are they available when the fast fermenters need them to degrade this and fast fiber? There is such a thing as fast fiber and slow fiber. And here we have it. So this is a range of qualities, maturities of grass. And these come from real data. Pasture grass has an NDF of say 40, maybe a little less than that, but its degradability is the green portion of that bar. 70 to 80% of that fiber is degradable. So relatively speaking, the good fiber, the fast fiber in green, the moderately slow fiber takes a little more than 30 hours to degrade, is in the yellow, and the orange brown is the woody, indigestible fiber that's there after 240-hour fermentation. Obviously, it doesn't stay in the rumen that long. Shouldn't. Otherwise, we're in trouble. But we see on the right side, straw, a lot of woody, indigestible fiber, some good fiber, not much, a lot of slow fiber. For yields of highest quality, we always recommend, hey, get that crop in the boot stage before head emergence, because you can see what happens. The proportion of green doesn't necessarily decrease that much, but what increases is the slow wood portion. Okay, I'm going to stop there. The other thing, the reason I put it on the cow here is because this reflects the rumen fill factor. Pasture does not fill the rumen very fast. You know this green is going to degrade very fast. So it's going to ferment fast, and what's the residue that's left is going to flow out the back end very quickly. On the right end, mature grasses and straw, there's a lot of wood. It doesn't take much to fill up this rumen space. And oh, by the way, she's got to degrade it so that this wood sinks. We all know that we used to float logs down rivers. That straw will float in that rumen and take up space until all the cells are opened up and that particle sinks and enters the fluid pool to pass out the back end of the cow. And that's what takes time. And that's where we focus on degradability. All right, that's a bad slide. Back to the rumen and some biochemistry. General picture, feed comes in, acetate, propionate, butyrate are generated as waste products. They're absorbed in the rumen epithelial, transported to the liver. Propionic acid undergoes gluconeogenesis, and we make blood glucose. And the blood supplies the mammary gland. How much acetate, propionate, and butyrate? The general molar proportion, if we take the gram molecular weight when we analyze rumen fluid, acetate is the predominant VFA generated in the rumen. Molar proportion 70 to 80%. Propionate, depending on the diet and how much starch is in the diet, 20 to 30% of the VFAs in rumen fluid will be from propionate. Butyrate, much lower, 10 to 20% at a molar proportion. If we turn that into grams, back to our 85 pounds of milk cow, that rumen should be generating about actually 4.8 kilograms, 4,800 grams of acetate, 2,600 grams of prop, and 14. Remember, she really relies on propionate for blood glucose and lactose production, right? So how can we make a whole lot of milk when we don't have a whole lot of propionate? Amber, here's your slide here. So our job as dairy managers and nutritionists is to maximize this, having the opportunity to put my arms in cows. They never go there. You don't want them there. That's DA. That's bad news, right? You want the cow to do this as many times in the day. Keep her comfortable, keep her well fed, because she only uses about that top space as the flux of intake. The quicker you can make that space, the more she can eat, and the more she'll be motivated to eat. Okay, biochemistry, propionate. We know goes to blood glucose through hepatic gluconeogenesis, and the sources of blood glucose, a lot of it's propionate, but also body tissue glucogenic amino acids. You're talking to some farms, how do cows hang on during these heat stress days for a few days? Their intake might drop, but they still hang on, right? Well, they quickly shift over to mobilize these rapidly available amino acids to provide that precursor. Trouble is, you got to keep in mind, you got to replenish these. We can't just say, "Oh, she's back on." We've got to make sure we replenish that amino acid reserve before she kicks into breaking down body fat, which will provide the glycerol portion. What uses blood glucose? The brain requires blood glucose. Red blood cells, kidney, and the mammary gland requires glucose. The immune system requires glucose. Lactose production is from glucose. 40 kg milk production, 85-pound cow. The mammary tissue will use 2.7 kgs of blood glucose. If the cow is sick with an activated immune system, that immune system takes charge, could require up to 2 to 3 kgs of blood glucose. The liver on this animal is generally producing about 3 kgs of blood glucose. So she has the potential to either make her full capacity of milk, or if she's not feeling well, this blood glucose is going to be split into her immune system and whatever's left for mammary. And that's what really hit me hard at that talk was whether it's the immune system or any stress that limits intake and the ability for the liver to make glucose is going to cost us somewhere. She's either going to get sick, lose milk, or both. Heat stress, flies, any discomfort, maximizing dry matter intake. Rick Grant is great on giving those presentations about cow comfort. If she's not comfortable, we're limiting her ability to make that glucose. Acetate, on the other hand, is utilized by fat tissue, muscle tissue, and the mammary gland. So basically, the rest of her body can rely on acetate for an energy source. Butyrate, as we mentioned, is predominantly used in the GI tract. This is a neat little slide. I found this just yesterday, and I was like, oh man, should have had more time. But at the top, it shows the carbohydrates producing the VFAs, liver making the blood glucose, glucose being partitioned into the various repro growth and health in milk production. It also shows this muscle tissue. The breakdown of muscle tissue can carry blood glucose production for a couple of days, providing the amino acids to go through the liver and do this. Adipose tissue provides the glycerol portion that can go to blood glucose. Otherwise, the long chain fatty acids can be utilized in the mammary gland. Heat stress, reduced feed intake. This system, all of a sudden, no deliveries, right? No deliveries of nutrients to the liver. Oh my gosh, cow's got to rely on body tissues to make up and keep that, you know, 80 blood glucose constant. Um, Here's another similar slide, a little different approach. Rumen micro, TMR, rumen fermentation. The molar proportion of acetate, butyrate, and prop going to the liver and how it's utilized. Okay, so I think this is my transition of how do you monitor, how do you monitor on a farm whether or not, she's able to maximize gluconeogenesis. And there's a number of ways. This slide is somewhat out of place, but it's an important one. So back to nutrient synchrony. This was a study conducted at Cornell, presented by Mike Van Amberg almost 10 years ago now. And what it shows is the total nutrient excretion through milk, urine, and fecal nitrogen across a range of diets that provided very low nitrogen intake, nitrogen being, times 6.25 to get protein, up to a higher. This was like a 14% protein diet, and this is an 18% protein diet. But what it shows is that the milk nitrogen output didn't change. In other words, milk production did not change over this range of diets. Milk casein did not change. Fecal nitrogen did not really change as the total dietary protein goes up. But what did change was her excretion of excess nitrogen above 16% protein. That's when you start seeing higher MUNs and ultimately higher urinary nitrogen excretion. It's the only way to get rid of it. But clearly, these diets were finely tuned so that the proper nitrogen sources, nitrogen, peptides, proteins, were provided with in combination with the carbohydrates um, to allow 40 kgs of milk production on basically 14 or 15% protein diets. Okay, we're the farmer, we're the farm advisor. We go out there and what do? We start trying to make our best assessments of how the cow's rumen is functioning. And we've all seen the fecal assessment tools. So I'm not going to cover that, but you look at the texture, you look at you can wash them and see, when you're washing the parlor, how much starch granules left on the parlor floor, how much fiber particle is left in that fecal um, material, and if are there any intestinal linings showing signs of acidosis and sloughing of internal tissues. Milk components, clearly. Fat protein ratio, do we stop there? No, you just don't look at the presents. Look at the ratio. Is there a protein inversion? Is the protein at 75 to 80% of the fat? And if not, we need to fix something. They're either short of fat or they're short of protein or there's an inversion. I really enjoy looking at de novos. I rely on these numbers a lot. Um, I should have put reference values here, but for a Holstein cow, you can be up around 1.2 percent of your milk fatty acids as de novo. The de novos are what she's making from acetate. She's putting these two carbon units of acetate together and getting up to a 14 carbon unit. On the analysis, you'll see 16 carbon. And this is, you can buy this and pay a lot of money for it out of a bag, or if she completes this fatty acid chain, that's where she stops. A completed de novo produced fatty acid is a 16 carbon chain. That's why it's kind of called mixed, because there are a number of ways you can attain this 16 carbon fatty acid. Preforms are generally the longer ones, 18 carbon units or longer. And again, you can they either come from body tissue, mobilization of fat, goes right into milk fat, and or you can buy it out of a bag. The other one I like to look at is MUNS. It's a good indicator of nitrogen excess or asynchronous delivery of the protein and carbohydrate fractions. And that's where it's critical to not only know the amount of the individual protein types, free nitrogen, ammonia nitrogen, uh, true peptide proteins, and the amount of carbohydrate, but the degradabilities, the rumen degradabilities are critical to know. And don't rely on book values. The labs are quite capable of giving you good analytical data on those fractions. This is a picture of, not a quiz, but this is a fecal splatter, and you can see the long fibers almost sticking up like spiky. So in this instance, um, low degradability of the forage fiber, inadequate rumen peptides to provide to the rumen bugs to do their best with this rumen fiber. So what did we do? We increased the starch, give them a little better carbohydrate, also increased the rumen peptides, gave them a little better rumen peptides. See an improvement in the spikiness, a little less on the undegraded fiber, a little too much on the rumen on the undegraded starch particles. So we haven't we made an improvement. Cows are doing better. Cows improved on that. Um, but this is not still not ideal, is what I'm trying to say, even though it looks better. This one, yeah, this is a little out of place, but back to the this is where my ADD comes into place. Um, Body proteins. Alanine is the chief protein of body tissue that gets utilized for gluconeogenesis. And the reason being, here are a lot of the proteins here, but alanine provides this 3-carbon. Once they cleave off the nitrogen, she's got a 3-carbon unit. You put 2 of them together, and the liver has a pretty easy job of gluconeogenesis. And that's why that amino acid is critical to replenish. You're not going to feed it. You're going to let the cow and the rumen bugs make it. But that's why amino acids are able to be the backbone. It can be considered a gluconeogenesis source. This, here's the triglyceride down below here. This is a true fat. We have the glycerol backbone. Again, the 3-carbon structure. Once we cleave off these free fatty acids, these can go downstream and go into milk fat or provide energy for the body as well. This can go to the liver and provide blood glucose. All right. Busy screen. This is NDS, and this is a study we ran years ago. Don't worry. These are the numbers we want you to look at. So this was a 50% forage diet using conventional corn, low NDF digestibility. The 30-hour on the corn was about 55, much lower than 60. This is woody corn silage, but we made up for it by feeding a fair amount of grain. We provide the rumen degradable true proteins, insufficient. We won't go into where this number needs to be, but if I have your diet, we can work with it. High level of slow fiber, rumen degradable protein is decent, but not quite enough given the quality of the forages. This ration provides 19.9% of the total protein is rumen degradable as a percentage of the dry matter. It's providing 6 pounds. The fermentability of it is 58%. And the reason I'm showing this is not for nutritional benchmarking, but for the capacity, the capability of these programs to help you look into the minutia in order to get the synchrony of carbohydrate and protein availability in the rumen. So we're just showing how I read this. So NDF digestibility of the total diet was low. Remember what I said about the corn silage? Rumen fermentability of the NDF of all the diet, not just forages, but there's cornmeal or a canola meal, which provides really poor fiber, was low. 34% of the total of the fermentable carbs is coming from NDF. This diet was relying a lot on degradable starch. 45% of the fermentable carbs in this diet were coming from starch, and you can see the rest there. This was the high fiber diet. We made the cows eat this slow degrading corn silage, and you can see as a proportion of all the carbs, she had to rely on slow NDF here, less starch, and so forth. This is a synchronicity function that we now have the capability of looking at. These are the same two diets. These cows ate 5 pounds less and made 5 pounds less milk than these cows. These cows are all making about 95 pounds of milk. These were 90 and going down. This is the minutia here. This is the complexity of diets and rumen function. Remember, this is higher grain. What we have is the amount of, in the red line, it's the amount of rumen available nitrogen over time. At time 1 hour, she eats, and she eats again at hour 7. So this is a 4-meal pattern schematic. The green bar is the amount of fermentable carbohydrate fermented in an hour in kilograms, and that's on here. I'm going to use the nitrogen axis only because it's close. You can see in this diet, the fermentable carb bar is above 30. In this diet, the fermentable carb bar is below 30, way below 30. The nitrogen was the same. So we have asynchronous fast nitrogen relative to the amount of carbohydrate at hour 1, gets closer in hour 2. At hour 3, we see that nitrogen is slightly low, and then it's very low relative to the slower carbohydrates. So here's an asynchronicity, and it's common for both diets. A lot of fast nitrogen, low on the fast carb, insufficient nitrogen for the slow carbs. We need more rumen degradable protein to fix that. The pool size is the height of the bars. You can see that just isn't as much fermentable carbohydrate in this diet compared to this diet. This is with BMR corn, highly digestible fiber. These cows are actually sick. If you're going to feed a high digestibility fiber, you have to feed the fiber. Otherwise, you simply overfeed grain. And you can see, remember, our first bar was just barely over 30. Now we're well over 30 on this BMR diet due to the fermentable fiber. We're way over again on nitrogen. Same scenario. It's just that the pool sizes of carbohydrate are much higher in the BMR diet due to the fermentability of the fiber compared to the conventional corn. Grass. I was recently looking at a pasture-based farm, and you can't help it, right? Up front in the talk, we saw grass provides sugar and fiber and a lot of nitrogen. And this is what happened. So this is a real study done in Ireland. Mike Deneen, uh, lush ryegrass from Ireland that was harvested and fed to the cows in tie stalls. So this is their actual production this is, yep, turned it into Americanized. They were crossbred jerseys, making 46 pounds of milk, 47 pounds of milk, 4.534 milk, decent production. Uh, their body condition stayed the same in the course of the 30 days that they were on trial. The diet was purely the ryegrass. Um, and that's all they were fed, no grain. So the nutrient profile of that diet of all grass was 18% protein. The NDF was 35. Obviously, all of the NDF came from forage. A lot of sugar, 21% sugar in that diet. No starch. That's just a residual carbohydrate there. But we can see the synchrony is, oh my gosh, we're wasting all of this nitrogen, even though we've got a lot of sugar, it's out of sync. We need some more carbohydrate in here that is rapid. And I know molasses is the first thing people are going to think about. Um, my experience with molasses is not always a fix. And the reason being, because what do we say about sugar? Sugar ferments to butyrate. Butyrate is utilized by the epithelium predominantly. It doesn't necessarily, um, it does grow some microbial protein, but it doesn't provide a really big carbohydrate source for the liver because it's all fermented in the rumen. If some of it escaped to the small intestine, then you'd be absorbing sugar as sugar rather than having it converted to butyrate. But this is something that's kind of the conundrum with grazing herds is how can we better align these? We've struggled with this. If we can't do it nutritionally, okay, what can we do? We can spare glucose, right? Up front, we know that the liver can make blood glucose out of propionate, not acetate, but body tissue. Where does she spend all the glucose? Well, if she's stressed, if she's heat stressed, if she's fly stressed, if she's bothered and not eating when she's out on pasture, she's spending spending energy rather than taking in energy. And I was like, oh my gosh, maybe the best thing we should be doing is simply giving these cows comfort and glucose spare by giving them comfort. You know, give them more shade, uh, time the feeding patterns more aligned to their crepidarious eating behavior, dawn and dusk. But anyway, just kind of free thinking out here, how to better um, utilize for production of blood glucose and expenditure of blood glucose if we can't totally fix this asynchronous nitrogen and carbohydrate ration. Okay. I'm providing this because I find this it's difficult to find a good picture of how microbes attach to forage particles. And what we need, all they need is a disrupted forage surface. Not necessarily the end of the particle, but if you scour, fracture, crush, and that's what the cows are doing with their jaw motion, is they're shearing. They're shearing forage particles, exposing the inside, breaking through that cutin layer that's protecting the plant when it's alive. Once it's in a rumen, if you shear that, these bugs, these microbes, will start attaching on the damaged area and form a biofilm of microbe that will attach and start exuding all of its enzymes and start degrading the cellulose. And this is a nice depiction of that happening here, producing the VFAs, the waste products, and so forth, pitting that cellulose structure, and ultimately making this forage particle less buoyant so that it takes on water, enters the rumen fluid pool, and flows out of the cow. And with that, I hope, I hope, I gave you some of this end of the feed bunk and not this end of the feed bunk. So that's about what I have. I guess we're available for questions or thoughts or whatever if you want to.
Yeah. Um, Thank you, Kurt. If anybody has any questions, they can throw them in the chat or just speak up. Uh, Kurt, you and I have been talking a lot about immune function and cows that prioritize that glucose production for immune function, and I think it's a whole another topic. Um, but I think we've been working with farms trying to connect the forage quality and nutrition aspect with production, and it's not that easy of a job, right? Like you can take the forages that a farm has and plug them into NDS and make it all look right on the computer screen, and then go out into a barn and see skinny cows, and you really explain that really well. So it's really all about keeping cows comfortable and minimizing those stressors that drive immune response.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, thanks, Aaron. Just to follow up on that, we've gone into so much detail of the ability to analyze feeds for the nutrients themselves, for the degradabilities, but there's still and then you have the programs that can utilize that information. It's still not the final answer. You've still got to go look at cows and put it all together. You still got to marry what you've got on the computer screen to what's actually happening out on the farm.
yeah. Our friend John is on here today and he asked a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Kurt.
Oop.
You can stop sharing your screen and I'll put mine back up. He says the de novo comment is great. The ability of the animal to supply the correct completed de novos versus the additives I think you touched on. He says, besides rumen function, what are the best ways to create completed de novos? I'm not sure if did that get answered, John, or do you have anything to say, Kurt?
Um, yeah, thanks, John. Good to hear from you. Glad you came up the other day. I think about you when I'm out there as well. Um, it's about cow comfort, acetate production. It's you're at that game where you have the two metal rods and you're rolling the ball bearing up the hill. That you get to the top and it's really difficult. It's minutia stuff, and all of a sudden you start looking at okay, maybe precisely balancing for amino acids. Maybe a supplemental amino acid would kick me over the edge or kick me to the top or the fatty acids themselves. This isotherm, providing those not the VFAs, but the iso acids that are precursors to those VFAs makes a lot of, in some cases it works. I haven't seen it on farm out here, but that's when you start thinking of are the micronutrients from some of these purchased feeds worth it? And that you can look at return on investment to really determine if it is. But yeah, you don't want to rely too much on preformed fats. You can make a lot of milk fat with, kind of melting cows away. But
They don't last very long that way, huh?
no, they don't last that long. And that's where I got onto the amino acid pool. We were on a farm. We said, hey, you may not see a milk response, but we need to better feed these cows in order for them to regenerate their reserves. And we saw that. It's like cows just look better, didn't make any more milk. They weren't doing bad, but it's like cows started to look better and look healthier. And you know what? They're able to withstand these 3 days of heat. It's like, holy smokes. Some of these farms are, the cows just start sucking wind after day 1 or 2. Some of them hang on for 3 or 4 days, hopefully weather the storm of the heat stress.
Right, but it takes a long time, right, to get back to that point of having healthy cows once they've
Yeah.
experienced that kind of stress. And I think that can be really difficult for producers working with a nutritionist and writing a check every month for nutrients to have that kind of patience. You know,
Uh,
Kurt, can you hear me?
yes, sir.
It's fascinating going to doing a lot of work up in Canada as well and looking at the dichotomy of how we do things here versus how they do things there. And there's so much up there. They're so palm first up there,
Hmm.
and irrelevant of rumen function, they basically just try to override the system with as much palm, and then they have that false sense of security that, oh, our components are good, so we're fine. And then you still look at de novos, and de novos are in the tank, but they still have good fat tests. So it's really fascinating, and really nice to hear your perspective on this, and what you see, because to me, I think it makes a lot of sense in things that, when you get trapped into the minutia of things, I think there are times when, we think there's a product out there that just can override, and we just don't worry about it, when really there's so many more important things there that we should be worried about.
Thanks, John. As you're saying that, I'm imagining I've done this more than once.
Yep.
You think you know where you're going and you go down the wrong road. Literally going down the wrong road. The only way to get back is to backtrack.
and
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 it take
doing yeah, and doing nutrition, you understand, you do your own diets, and you're involved and enveloped in that herd for so long, and you get down a road, and you can't see the field through the trees, because you're just so, you think you have the idea, and you just chase that rabbit, and chase that rabbit, and chase that rabbit, and you never get anywhere.
right, right. Oh my.
all right. We'll start wrapping up here, but if anyone has any more questions, you can drop them in the chat or just speak up.
Q&A. Amber, what kind of herd is this? Is this cow calf operation there? Is this your herd?
Not my herd, you know that, Kurt. um, Coming up in this series, our August webinar will focus on assessing calf and heifer management practices in New England. Glenda and Sarah they're right in the middle or towards the end of a project working with a group of farms in New Hampshire and Maine to provide technical assistance and measuring body weight and daily gain of calves and heifers at various stages. And we will hear all about that project at the end of August. So we hope to see you back here. Again, you can scan this QR code or visit the UVM Extension Northwest Crops and Soils Conferences and Events page to register. And thank you. If you could take a moment to fill out our survey, Susan has dropped it in the chat as well. We would really appreciate it. Share with us any other topics that you would like to see webinars cover in the future, and hope you have a great day. Thank you.